Recording start. Hello and most welcome to 1638 of the Heidegger series. And we will continue with Life, Death by Jacques Derrida. And we are currently into the third session. Page 87. In the last episode, 1237, sorry. We had many interesting discussions about double takes, dreaming, reproduction, selection, biological discourse, pedagogical discourse, and so forth. We were comparing, so to speak, the verso and recto of Nietzsche, his perception of himself, what is his inner and what is his outer. Page we ended on in 1634. And the last one was I would like to say. And it begins with, hence I never fail to be surprised when I give a course. Hence I never fail to be surprised when I give a course. Surprise is that structure that draws meta language back, that always surprises it in its naivety. Surprises it at the moment of its withdrawal, shows it that it is no longer virginal, that it is already violated by the ear, quite fitting, at least as you will have heard, and the smaller the ear, the better. And it procures, so long as this surprise is affirmed and reaffirmed by the one who has the force to give into it in the end. Pleasure, a pleasure that, in keeping with the essence of pleasure or of desire, must be and remain dubious, entrusted to the other to take or to leave. One never knows where a course will go. That of which one speaks, and those to whom one speaks, always have in reserve something to say in advance. Not only about the course, but about pedagogical theory. The bus named pleasure, therefore, how is it going to continue to work? I am not going to talk to you about metaphor in Nietzsche. Others have done this before me and done it better in the last few years. I refer you to the excellent works of Sarah Kaufmann, and especially Nietzsche and metaphor. For my part, I am going to reproduce and select in this very place of the failing meta language, this place of a specific failing where metaphorical language, far from being a rhetorical means of dominating a field or of passing from one field to another, far from being only transitional object between two discourses, to put it metaphorically, is itself explained in its possibility as an effect of selection, reproduction, as it is operating in several fields. What I just said is not so clear. Let me say it in another way. The schema, reproduction, selection, for example, is not a schema that one metaphor, that some metaphor would transport from one determinate field to another, to the political institutional or to the academic, or vice versa. It is not primarily in this sense that it is metaphorical. It is metaphorical in the sense that it is the origin of metaphor in general. Metaphor does not transport selection, reproduction, like a bee or a bus from one place to another. Could we have the text a bit enlarged, please? Yeah, 175 is much better. Metaphor is an effect of reproduction, selection. It is itself subjected to the genetico-institutional law of reproduction, selection. In his discourse on metaphor, and not only in the metaphoricity of his discourse, Nietzsche himself has recourse to the schema of reproduction, selection. He does not just explain life or school with metaphors. He also explains metaphor with the laws of life or school, laws of life and of school. Let me take an example that will make this clearer to you. It comes once again from the Philosophenbuch, which contains, as you already know, a whole theory of metaphor, of the relations between metaphor and concept. This theory of metaphor claims to return to some of the biophysiological foundations of perception, of knowledge, to a whole structure of neural activity in the constitution of sensory images, etc. Well, in the description of the image in general, and then in the description of thought in images, that is to say, through metaphors, etc. The schema reproduction, selection is explicitly at work. See, for example, fragments 65 to 67. I select, first of all, this. Dreaming as the selective extension of visual images. In the realm of the intellect, everything qualitative is merely quantitative. We are led to qualities by the concept, the word. In other words, the beyond of the quantitative, of economic, etc., is an impression produced by languaged concepts and words. Here is the following fragment, number 66. Perhaps the human being is incapable of forgetting anything. The operations of seeing and knowing are much too complicated for it to be possible completely to efface them again. Which means that from this point on, all forms that once have been produced by the brain and the nervous system are repeated frequently in the same way. An identical neural activity generates the same image once and again. End of quotation. According to this hypothesis, or Nietzsche says perhaps, frequently, and so on. Insofar as forgetting which we said earlier was called for by the affirmation of the last man, is acknowledged to be impossible. Total forgetting being impossible. Like an absolutely complete memory or a total reproduction. Reproduction will be selective, and selection reproductive. It is in the process of this reproduction selection, which is a process of inscription or path breaking along a surface that the image as reproduction, selection of sensation is also a phenomenon of pleasure, displeasure. This phenomenon of pleasure, displeasure can give rise to selection only insofar as in the battlefield and agonistics between different forces, differences of forces, the stronger eliminating the weaker, and knowledge insofar as it has its origin in these processes of inscription on neural surfaces is inseparable from this selectivity of images, as we will soon see of metaphors. I spoke earlier of pleasure and of displeasure. Of dubious pleasure and here it is as if by accident the question of pleasure. I leave the dubious for later. Let me read on. Fragment 67. The most delicate sensations of pleasure and displeasure constitute the true raw material of all knowledge. The true mystery is that surface onto which the activity of the nerves in pleasure and pain inscribes its forms. Sensation immediately projects forms which in turn generate new sensations. It belongs to the very nature of sensations of pleasure and displeasure to express themselves in adequate motions. The sensation of the image is created due to the fact that these adequate motions cause other nerves to experience sensations. Let me clarify, for this is not very clear. The pleasure-displeasure association associated with every impression is what it attracts, brings together, gathers together other nerves, what interests them, as it were, in the impression and in reproduction. And this interest of pleasure with agonistics and within the economic is at the origin of images. Which are themselves selective reproductions, always already invested with pleasure or displeasure. Knowledge will never be unaffected by it. And here now is the passage to which I most wanted to attract your attention. It follows right after what I just commented on. Darwinism is right even with regard to thought in images. The stronger image devours the weaker ones. And Nietzsche immediately adds after a space where the thinking occurs with pleasure or displeasure is an absolutely essential distinction. Anyone who finds it difficult will be less inclined toward it and will probably not get as far. He will advance less far, not wanting to accept that thought advances according to the principle of pleasure, displeasure. He forces himself, and in this realm that is useless, there will thus be, to follow this line of thought, a natural selection of metaphors, obeying the reason of the strongest, there would be a socio-biological, politico-biological system of images in a state of war. And one might imagine every type of war and weapon every type of territorial occupation, diplomatic alliance, annexation, war of attrition, and so on. And it is not only the images that would be more or less forceful, but also the representatives of forces. That is to say, as always, differences of force. And let me recall, since this is important for what we are talking about here, This political biological selection of images is inseparable from the reproductive process that is in the origin of this image and that links its genesis to the principle of pleasure, displeasure. A supplementary complication comes, as it were, to illustrate and confirm in Nietzsche's very writing the thesis he seems to advance. It is apparently by metaphor that he invokes here natural selection and the law of the strongest. He imports this metaphor from a genetic field and applies it to a psycho-rhetorical field. And he takes a certain pleasure in this expatriation and violent extension this violent extension important. He knows he's doing it since he says Darwinism is right, even with regard to thought in images. In other words, Nietzsche demonstrates that conceptual thought, its rule of comprehension and extension, proceeds by metaphor, and he states, this is not a statement, but through the act of stating. He says in a metaphor that the concept is metaphorical. He forces the limits between distinct fields by saying that thought consists in doing just this, etc. I am not going to insist, as one could, on this text or head in this direction. Another supplementary complication if in 1872 Nietzsche says Darwin is right beyond even what Darwin could believe, it is for the same reasons that he will soon no longer assert that Darwin is right. Nietzsche will then come to reproach Darwin under the title of anti-Darwin. This will be the title of several fragments collected in The Will to Power, with having conceived of this selection or this law of the strongest in a simple way, that is, without taking into account the enigmatic possibility of inversion that constitutes it, namely the regular domination not of the strongest, but of the weakest, the elimination of strokes of luck, the neutralization by the average of all excesses in force, and so on. And in this very so on, I will put a stop. Go to the summary and discussion. There were several interesting sites here. Page 58. At the very bottom, what I just said is not so clear. Let me say it in another way. The schema reproduction selection, for example, is not a schema that some metaphor would transport from one determinate field to another, from the biological or political institutional or to the academic, or vice versa. And further down we find it is metaphorical in the sense that it is the origin of metaphor in general. Metaphor does not transport selection reproduction like a bee or a bus from one place to another. And here we have, of course, DNA. You get an explanation for what we previously went through. Metaphor is an effect of reproduction selection. It is itself subjected to the genetical institutional law of reproduction selection. So it's about selection of metaphor, but metaphorically it's also about biology, language, and life. We go to page 60, the very top. We started the page before. Is acknowledged to be impossible. Total forgetting being impossible. Like an absolutely complete memory or a total reproduction, the very top of page 60. If you go up a bit there, you'll find it. Yes, indeed, there we have it. Reproduction will be selective and selection reproductive. So now you can see this in memory, and memory is a sort of engraving in the neurons. Then themselves, memories acts like DNA and reproduction. They reproduce memories. And Nietzsche will also mention nothing can escape this engraving. Nothing can be truly forgotten. And he also go into the drive for this. We will find that under the quote on the same page. If you go down a bit, will be the quote. And under that one, beginning with "let me clarify," directly under. Let me clarify, for this is not very clear. The pleasure, displeasure associated with every impression is what attracts, brings together, gather together other nerves. What interests them, as it were, in the impression and in reproduction. So there is a reproduction, there is a gathering, also in the engravings in the memory. And we can compare that to the engravings we discussed in Custer and Hoover. There also being reproduced. And in that last lecture with Hoover, we discussed reproduction should be both flexible and rigid. We go to page 61. And towards the end, the last paragraph, in the middle of the last paragraph, and Nietzsche is using the law of the strongest and natural selection. And beginning, you can mark, he imports the fourth line in that paragraph. He imports this metaphor, and you can continue, from a genetic field and applies it to a psycho-rhetorical field. And he takes a certain pleasure in this expatriation and this violent extension. He knows he's doing it, since he says Darwinism is right even with regard to thought in images. In other words, and now it's becoming interesting, Nietzsche demonstrates that conceptual thought, its rule of comprehension and extension, proceeds by metaphor. And he states that this is not a statement, but through the act of statement. So here we see once more this movement, as I spoke of 2 lectures ago, between the static origin of the metaphor and the movement that metaphoricity brings forward. The text is not static, it's not still. It is alive. It's going forward, and although the inscriptions, the engravings in the nerves are there forever, they are still brought forward by metaphoricity. They are the same, but not the same. Mother and father together. And this is obviously very close to what we discussed in 1636 with Hoover, that both strictness and this randomness, want, belief, could be fantasy also, imagination. They both participate. And they are both needed for the forward movement. A good comparison is to call metaphor the fantasy, the randomness, the thing that brings beyond. And that makes randomness even more acceptable because it's a necessity. And that will also bring out the truth of the text. Maybe a comment from my dear colleague Kalle here.
Yes, let's go to this paragraph on the same page 61. I will read this quotation from Nietzsche. Whether thinking occurs with pleasure or displeasure is an absolutely essential distinction. Anyone who finds it difficult will be less inclined toward it, and will probably also not get as far. He will advance less far, not wanting to accept that, though that thought advances according to the principle of pleasure, displeasure. He forces himself, and it is that is useless.
Yeah, indeed, very good. Fantastic.
So this makes me think about Heidegger's affirmation that denken is danken, thinking is thanking.
Yeah, definitely.
So can we say there is a difference between Heidegger and Nietzsche, and so in Nietzsche here he makes a very clear dichotomy, and I don't think it's in real life it's possible to make this kind of clear dichotomies between thinking. So he says that higher thinking, let's say philosophy, if you find philosophy is difficult, then it's not pleasurable. But I think it's, I don't know if we can agree with Nietzsche here.
Mm.
What do you think?
Well, he seemed to say that pleasure is a sort of a driving force in this evolution of metaphors, how they compete, and the one that's strongest survives. So he takes a Darwinian approach to thinking metaphors and thoughts themselves. And he says what could be dubious, yes, Kalle, is the driving force, that it is pleasure or displeasure. So to be compared with survival, non-survival. But very good. It's similar to Duncan Denken. Yes. Thinking should be thankful and give pleasure. It should be, well, you can see, let's see, you can see it this way. When thinking is creative, when it's strong, when it's intellectual, we've been speaking about that a lot. Intellectual, it can only becomes when the subject is in on it, when there is a certain randomness, intention, subjectivity to it, then it becomes pleasurable, becomes thankful. And if it's thankful for you, it would be thankful for others. Great authors that take pleasure in what they write. Shakespeare often testified to this. And of course, we today take a lot of pleasure in reading Shakespeare. That's could be maybe a pointer to Duncan.
Now I have to admit that I first misinterpreted Nietzsche in this paragraph. I thought he meant that that displeasure. I understood it in lines of anti-Heidegger, but he's actually Heidegger here. That Nietzsche says that if you have pleasure, then thinking is not difficult, and then you will make progress. And that's, yes, so he's actually Heidegger in this sense. He's not saying that if you find thinking difficult, or rather, he says that if you find thinking difficult, then it's not pleasurable. But he wants that thinking is doing with pleasure. You should find it playful, like that's the point.
Yeah, playful, creative, and that can also be applied to Hoover and the new text you got, Clark, in the transliteration of engravings. Compare that to engravings in the neurons. So there is definite a parallel here. We can get back to that later in the afternoon. I say thank you. I'm just going to stop the recording.
Yes.
Thank you very much. It was
Thank you.
very rewarding. It's difficult part of the text. Until next.